Hi, I'm pleased to bring to you ascending and descending tracts made easy. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of neuroscience. It helps you to understand and appreciate how the body is coordinated with the brain as the center. We want to look at how the receptors of the skin send and transmit stimuli through first, second, and third order neurons to the cerebral hemispheres, and for it to be interpreted and then sent down by motor neurons all the way to the skeletal muscles. I'm Dr. Aidoo with the Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology, University of Cape Coast. This is a generalized structure of the brain. We have the one in gold being the frontal lobe. The one in green is the parietal lobe. The purple one is the occipital lobe, and then the red one is the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is necessary for planning of movements, recent memory, emotions, and even personality. Then within it, you have this region called the precentral gyrus, which is the primary motor cortex. Then within the parietal lobe, you have the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. In between the two is the central sulcus. So if you remember in one of my videos, I made mention of a pre and then a post. So it is the central sulcus, which is also known as the central sulcus of Rolando, that is dividing these two areas into the pre and then post. So the pre-central gyrus, which is necessary for primary motor cortex, is a point where all the motor fibers which will innervate skeletal muscles will originate from and move down into the spinal cord in the form of corticospinal tracts. For the postcentral gyrus, it's going to receive third order neurons which are carrying sensory information. So that is the afferent pathway. You will look at them in details. The occipital lobe is for vision, and again I have covered this in one of my videos where we looked at the pathway of the vision or the vision pathway all the way from the optic nerve, optic tract, and then to the lateral geniculate body, and then through the optic radiation all the way to the primary visual center in the occipital lobe. The cerebellum is used for some motor activities which are unconscious. Okay, we call that the unconscious pathway. We look at that. This is the brainstem, which has also been covered in a very simple video. So you see the midbrain, pons, and then medulla. If you look at a sagittal section of the brain, this is how it's going to look like. So that's the cerebral cortex made up of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and then you also have the temporal lobe, which is showing at that point. That is the corpus callosum, which helps to transmit information between the two hemispheres. That is the thalamus, and if you remember the video on the ventricles and then formation of CSF, it played a very important role. That is the cerebellum. So you expect to have the fourth ventricle located there. You can see that this shade of blue and the arrow is pointing at the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe, which means that it is receiving sensory stimuli. Okay, all the information picked by receptors in the skin, being it touch, whether it is fine touch or crude touch, pressure, pain and temperature, proprioception, 2-point discrimination, all of them arise at this point. So you realize that the surface of the cerebral hemisphere is dark and the inside is white. So you have the white matter in the middle and then gray matter at the periphery, unlike the spinal cord. This is because the white area is carrying most of the fibers, the axons, and their cell bodies will be at the periphery. Okay, will be at the periphery where you have some of the motor neurons actually originating from. So you have the cell bodies of the motor neurons, and then their axons will also come down. All right, so most of the time you find that the superficial portions of the cerebral hemispheres look darker than the inside. Again, you can see that neuron 1 is here, neuron 2, and then that is neuron 3. Those are the order of neurons that the ascending pathway contains. So if you say ascending pathways, we mean that nerves that are carrying impulses from the skin all the way to the brain, they are ascending or moving upward. That is why they are called ascending pathways. So you have discriminative touch, conscious proprioception, and then vibration sense. It will pass through the spinal cord and go to the medulla, the dorsal portions of the medulla. Because this pathway is also going at the dorsal area of the spinal cord and also some portions of the medulla, we call it the dorsal column pathway. All right. Axons cross to the other side in the medulla, which means that the first order neurons, when they get to the medulla, they will synapse with a second order neuron, which goes through the pons and then midbrain and then to the thalamus. At the thalamus, it will synapse with another order of neuron, the third order neuron, which will go to the primary somatosensory cortex. You remember a video that covered the thalamus where we saw several nuclei of the thalamus, and I told you that, or related the thalamus to the job of the chief of staff, that before you get to the president who is sitting in the cerebral hemisphere, you need to speak to the chief of staff. So this is one of it. You can see that this second order neuron is ending and synapsing with another neuron in the thalamus. So there are several nuclei centers in the thalamus, as we saw in that video. This is the thalamocortical tract somatosensory radiation. As we will see, it will pass through the internal capsule before it gets to the cerebral hemisphere. Another important thing you have to note here is the second order neuron. Once the first order neuron synapses with the second order neuron in the medulla, it will decussate, which means that it will cross to the opposite side and then ascend upwards. Once it does that, it is known as the medial lemniscus. Okay, so the medial lemniscus are actually second order neurons, axons of second order neurons. So this is a coronal section through the brain, showing you how the fibers run. This is the internal capsule which will contain both ascending and descending tracts. That is the thalamus, and it is assumed that second order neuron has synapse with nuclei here, so that is a third order neuron going to the primary somatosensory cortex. That is the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, globus pallidus, and then the putamen. We've covered these two in another video, so in order to refresh your mind on that, you can look at that, so that you will be able to tell what the striatum means and what corpus striatum also mean. The spinal cord, afferent neuron organization, ascending tracts, fascicula and columns. The ascending tracts are also called the fasciculi or the ascending column. It can also be called a funiculus. So these are synonymous names that are describing the fibers. When we say fibers, we are talking about nothing than the axons, okay, of the neuron. That's all. So those axons are thread-like in nature. So they are just like a thread, a fiber, or a thread, or a thin line. So that is what is called the tract. The same thing is called the fascicula. The same thing is called the column. So don't ever be confused with these things. They are just representing the axon. So as I said earlier on, you have a first order neuron, second order, and then a third order neuron. The first order neuron, these have cell bodies in a ganglion, either the dorsal root, and conduct impulses from the skin's cutaneous receptors and from proprioceptors to the brainstem or spinal cord. A first order neuron synapses with a second order neuron. So all that this is saying is that the first order neuron has its ganglion in the dorsal root, what we usually call the dorsal root ganglion when we are looking at spinal nerves. So that is what is picking impulses from the skin or proprioceptors, that is the muscle and joints, and they send that information into the spinal cord. Their cell body is a type of pseudo-unipolar neuron. So the cell body is outside there, and accumulation of it is what is termed as the ganglion, dorsal root ganglion, which enters the spinal cord through the dorsal horn. Now you realize that this afferent neuron is in red, so it's a first order neuron. Then you can have a second order neuron also starting from the spinal cord. Okay, we will explain why some of them have their second order neurons in the thalamus and some of them having theirs right in the spinal cord. It's because they are carrying different modalities of impulses, different stimuli. So if it is a pain and temperature kind of pathway, then you have the synapsing occurring at the level of the spinal cord, like this one. In that case, the green one, which is the second order neuron, is the one that will cross the midline of the spinal cord. It's going to cross the midline to the other side with reference to the central canal. That is the only way you'll be able to tell that a fiber has really crossed to the other side. You have to use the central canal as a reference point and see whether the fiber is actually going across it to the other side. Then it rises. This area of ascension is actually above the spinal cord. So if this is a section through, say, a thoracic level of the spinal cord, thoracic segment, it means that you have cervical segment of the spinal cord above, and this particular second order neuron will go through all those white matter of those spinal cord. Okay, because this is where it's ascended. It is at this level of the spinal cord that it crossed. It has crossed at that level. It's not going to cross at the level above it. It is this very level. So if this is, let's say, T6, it has crossed at T6. It's not going to cross at T5. It is rather going to ascend through T5 all the way through the medulla, and then through the pons, then through the midbrain, and then to the thalamus. So eventually, when you get to the thalamus, it has gone to the chief of staff. No matter who you are, you need to tell the thalamus whatever you are carrying. So you need to synapse there, and it is at that point that the third order neuron will emerge towards the primary somatosensory cortex. So second order neurons have cell bodies in the spinal cord's dorsal horn or in the medullary nuclei that transmit impulses to the thalamus or cerebellum. Third order neuron, these have cell bodies in the thalamus and send impulses to the cerebrum. So that is how the order of neurons for ascending tracts are arranged. There are no third order neurons in the cerebellum. Okay, so note that. We will look at that. Is why it is called the unconscious pathways. There are three primary types of ascending tracts on each side of the spinal cord. You have the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, you have the spinothalamic pathway, and you have the spinocerebellar pathways. Let's take each of them one after the other. So we take the dorsal or posterior column medial lemniscal pathway. It is dorsal or posterior because the fibers enter the dorsal or posterior portion of the spinal cord, and then they ascend. Okay, that's why it's called the dorsal posterior column. Now for that one, we can use this simple diagram to describe it. So the dorsal or posterior column medial lemniscal pathway, you have the first order neuron going through the spinal cord as an afferent fiber. Obviously, its cell body will be in the dorsal root ganglion. Then it will enter the dorsal horn through the tract of Lesser and then ascend through the white matter of the dorsal portion of the spinal cord. Remember, its cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion, so you are not going to have a gray matter there. It's now axons that are ascending, so it is within that region where you find the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, depending on the level of spinal cord that this fiber is arising. You remember we've also covered this in another video where I told you the differences between the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis and which one is seen throughout the segment of the spinal cord and which one arises at a particular point of the spinal cord segment. Now, once it rises, it's still the first order neuron, mind you. It rises and gets to the medulla. That is where it will synapse with a second order neuron. So if this is a fasciculus gracilis type of fiber, then it is going to synapse with a nucleus gracilis in the medulla. If it is a fasciculus cuneatus type of fiber, is going to synapse with a nucleus called the nucleus cuneatus at the spinal cord level. But we know that the fasciculus gracilis is more medial, and therefore the nucleus gracilis will also be medial. So if we are looking at this technically, we can see that it's quite lateral. So we can give it to fasciculus what cuneatus, which is more lateral. But that notwithstanding, we are only trying to see the pathway. So whether it is fasciculus cuneatus or gracilis, it will still serve the same purpose. So it is in the medulla that it will synapse. So the second order neuron will cross the midline at the level of the medulla and then rise as an axon of the second order neuron through the rest of the midbrain towards the thalamus. Now, as it is going so, we call that the medial lemnisci pathway. So the medial lemnisci pathway is a second order neuron, the axon of the second order neuron that has crossed and gone to the other side. This second order neuron is actually belonging to the posterior column. Okay, posterior column. And it's important to know this, and we will soon get to know the sense or stimuli that this pathway is carrying. It is carrying 2-point discrimination, graphesthesia, and then stereognosis. So 2-point discrimination and then conscious proprioception. Okay, knowing your muscle sense where your joints are and how you are positioned in space. All these are the stimuli coordinated by this pathway. So let's continue. We've talked about the second order neuron. The third order neuron obviously is going to have a cell body or nuclei in the thalamus and then go through the internal capsule. Its axons will go to the internal capsule and go to the primary somatosensory cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex. So that is the simple way of going about the posterior column medial lemnisci pathway. Then you also have another pathway known as the spinocerebellar pathway from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Transmits information about tendon or muscle stretching to the cerebellum, so it can coordinate the activities of skeletal muscles. So that is the spinocerebellar, and usually this one is quite straightforward, as we will see, from the spinal cord straight to the cerebellum. So it is usually an unconscious pathway. We usually say unconscious pathway to pathways which do not go to the cerebral cortex. And you have the spinothalamic pathway, which transmits pain and temperature and then pressure. Pain and temperature and pressure pathways. As we will see, that one has a different pathway. We will come to that. So just to emphasize, medial lemnisci pathway. The medial lemnisci is a second order neuron of the dorsal column medial lemnisci pathway. By the somatotopic arrangement, it transports the sensory information of conscious proprioception, vibration, and then what? Touch, and 2-point discrimination of skin and joints of the body and head. So we have looked at that. This one is giving you 2 axons, if you like, okay, or 2 neurons that are going through the spinal cord. They come as an afferent neuron with its cell body in the dorsal root, and then it goes into the dorsal horn and then rises. This one also cell body in dorsal root ganglion, goes to the dorsal horn and rises. There's no synapsing at this point. So it's the same nerve or neuron that is going up. it gets to the medulla, and then it will synapse. So the one which is most lateral will be a fasciculus cuneatus, and it's going to synapse with a nucleus cuneatus at the medulla, as you can see. Then it will cross the midline and come to the other side of the medulla and rise. And as it rises, it is called a medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus because it is medial, it is moving in the medial portion. When we take this green one to at a lower level of the spinal cord segment, you have this and it will rise. So like I told you in the earlier slide, it will rise through. It's no longer going to do any cross. It's just going to go through its path all the way to the medulla. So you can see this will be more of a fasciculus gracilis, synapsing at the fasciculus nucleus gracilis at the medulla, and then it also crosses the midline and then rises to the thalamus, and then third order neuron will now pick the information and take it to the primary somatosensory cortex. Now let's look at the spinothalamic pathway. It's also a conscious pathway because it's going to the cerebral hemisphere. So for that one, the first order neuron also having its ganglion, the dorsal root, goes through the dorsal horn, and then it doesn't rise, but then it synapses with the second order neuron. It's the second order neuron that now crosses on the other side and then rises all the way up. So this is a typical example of the ascending pathway that we used earlier on to describe the first, second, and third order neurons of the ascending pathway. Because you remember that one, there was a crossing. It goes across the central canal. I remember telling you that it is the central canal that you use to tell whether a fiber has actually crossed the other side or not. If it doesn't bypass the central canal and just rises up again, it will be on its lateral or the same side. Once it crosses, it becomes contralateral. So it goes through all the way to the midbrain and then to the thalamus. So it will first go to this, the spinal cord. So it will first go through the medulla, go through the pons and the midbrain. They are not showing, this diagram is not showing you the midbrain and then the pons, but it will go through that because that's the brain stem. It passes through the brain stem before it gets to the thalamus. Then third order neuron will go to what? Primary somatosensory cortex, which is the postcentral gyrus. So this is how simple it is. Okay, first, second, third order. So that is the arrangement. You have to go through this and practice it, and it will stay.